Mom abandoned me after Dad's death, but when she found out I'd inherit Grandpa's fortune, she reached out, and I exposed her secret plan. When I was 17 years old, just a few months away from turning 18, my life changed in the most painful and sudden way imaginable. My dad passed away. He suffered from a cardiac arrest. One moment, he was there with us, full of life, and the next, he was gone. It's still hard to wrap my head around how quickly everything shifted. There were no warnings, no gradual lead up to say our goodbyes or prepare ourselves emotionally. Just like that, my dad, the person who meant the most to me, was ripped away from my life. We shared an incredibly close bond. He was the one I turned to for advice, comfort, and laughter. So, losing him felt like losing a part of my soul. After my dad's funeral was done, when we were still in the haze of grief, my dad's lawyer gathered the family together to announce his will. My dad was in no way a very wealthy man, but he had always worked hard his whole life and had made the right investments. The lawyer announced to the shock of everyone that he had pretty much left everything to me. The family home also belonged to him and he had signed over the deeds to the house in my name. At first, I didn't fully grasp the weight of what that meant, especially in the midst of dealing with the grief of losing him. But while I was still processing it, my mom was absolutely furious. The moment she heard that the house was now legally mine, she started to yell and loudly ask the lawyer to show her the will for verification. For context, my parents had one of the worst marriages in history. There was constant tension between my mom and dad, and it wasn't as though one person was to blame, both of them had their flaws. They had originally gotten married out of love, or at least that's how they described it, but whatever love there once was had quickly faded away. Their differences started to grow more and more and their love was replaced by resentment and frustration. Both of my parents were very career-oriented, and while you might think that would give them something in common, it actually drove them further apart. My mom couldn't stand my dad's success. This was because when she chose to have a child it made her miss out on her career for several years. To be clear, my dad never forced her. My mom has told me several times about how she was unsure about becoming a parent but eventually decided to get pregnant anyway because she didn't want to regret not having kids later in life. However, once she had me, she realized pretty quickly just how much she hated me. Not every adult should be allowed to become parents, and my mom is a classic example of that. My earliest memories of my mom are stained with her impatience and anger. I can still vividly recall moments when she would snap at me for the smallest things, whether it was not tying my shoes correctly or struggling with my homework. She made me feel like I was a burden from the very start. As a child, I could sense her disdain even if I couldn't fully understand it. I would see other kids with their moms, getting hugs, encouragement, and warmth, but all I got from her was criticism and coldness. My mom's frustration with her own life spilled over into how she treated me, and it was impossible not to feel like I was in the way. After she gave birth to me, my mom had to take several years off from her career because of pregnancy complications and health issues. She hated the fact that she couldn't work and pretty much blamed me. During this time, my dad was the one supporting the family, and he thought this would be the perfect opportunity for my mom to bond with me. But that never happened. Instead of using this time to build a connection with me, my mom stayed emotionally distant. She would often tell me and my dad how she wasn't built to be a mother and how she wished I was never born. As a result, my dad and she would have several fights, where he would threaten to divorce her instead of taking her to see a psychiatrist. My mom would, in turn, threaten to take me away from him just to punish him for leaving her. Clearly, my mom resented how things had turned out, not only in her marriage but also in motherhood. Often, my mother distracted herself by watching TV at home, zoning out for hours, or going out with her friends, leaving me alone without any care or attention. She didn't even bother hiring a babysitter most of the time. I was left to fend for myself. The few times she was around, she made it clear she wanted nothing to do with traditional motherly responsibilities. She hated cooking, and I can't remember her ever making me a proper meal. My diet mostly consisted of frozen foods, mac and cheese, pizza rolls, anything that didn't require effort. For a long time, that's all I knew. At the time, I didn't mind because I was too young to know any better, but now I've come to realize just how neglected I was. It wasn't just about the lack of homemade meals or the absence of a warm hug, it was the emotional abandonment that hurt the most. Very quickly, I learned not to complain about anything to my mom. Anytime I tried to express my feelings or needs, it would backfire. Instead of taking any responsibility or trying to fix things, she would just scold me and make me feel like it was all my fault. It became easier to keep my feelings to myself and avoid triggering her anger. I was walking on eggshells, constantly trying not to upset her, constantly trying to make myself invisible. That's the reality I lived with, and it left deep scars. My dad, in contrast to my mom, made me feel seen and valued. I wouldn't say he was the perfect parent, he had his flaws too, but he was definitely the better of the two. Unlike my mom, he actually enjoyed spending time with me, and I never got the sense that he was doing it out of some sense of obligation. He genuinely cared about being present in my life, and that made all the difference. As I started growing up, things changed in our household. My mom eventually went back to work, but she never quite regained the same prestigious position she had before she took time off. She hated starting from the bottom again, having to rebuild her career when she felt she had already paid her dues. In some ways, I could understand her frustration, losing years of career progress and feeling like she was trapped by her circumstances, but that didn't make it any easier to be on the receiving end of her resentment. When my mom resumed working, I ended up spending a lot of time alone after school. I'd come home, make myself a simple lunch, and finish my homework. It became routine, and honestly, I was used to fending for myself by that point. I had pretty much learned not to expect much from my mom in terms of emotional or physical care. But my dad still made an effort. On some nights, he would take me out to dinner, just the two of us. My mom never joined us. She kept herself distant, almost as if she were an outsider in her own family. During those dinners, my dad and I would talk about everything and anything. He'd tell me about his job, sometimes the interesting projects he was working on or office drama, and I'd tell him all about my school life, my friends, or whatever was on my mind. For those couple of hours, everything felt normal. It was a rare moment where I didn't feel like a burden or an afterthought. I just felt like a daughter having a nice time with her dad. I really cherished those moments because they gave me a sense of security and connection. When I turned 14, my mom got a new job that required her to travel a lot. It was a high-paying position, and I think she saw it as her chance to finally reclaim some of the career success she had lost. She decided to accept the position without even bothering to discuss it with my dad, which led to one of the biggest fights I had ever witnessed between them. My dad didn't oppose her working, but this job meant she'd be gone for days at a time, and suddenly, he was left to take care of me entirely on his own. I remember hearing them argue late into the night, their voices echoing through the house, and the main point of contention was me. I hated that. I hated knowing that I was the source of so many of their fights. Later, I went to my dad's study and told him that he didn't need to worry about me, and that I could take care of myself when he was at work. I thought if I could just prove that I wasn't a burden, maybe things would be better between my parents. When I said that, I remember the look on his face, guilt washed over him. He pulled me into a hug as if he understood that I had been forced to grow up faster than I should have. It was one of those moments where we both acknowledged, without saying it outright, how dysfunctional things really were. Soon after, my mom officially started her new job, and she began disappearing for days at a time. When she was gone, the house felt quieter, almost peaceful, but when she was back, it wasn't any better. She rarely spoke to me, and when she did, it was like talking to a stranger. There was no warmth, no sense of connection. I'd see her come home exhausted, barely glancing in my direction, and then disappear into her room or back out with her friends. Even though we were physically in the same space, she felt a million miles away. It hurt, but by that point, I had learned not to expect much from her. By the time I turned 16, my parents' marriage was practically non-existent. They were sleeping in different bedrooms as if they were merely roommates. If you're wondering why they didn't just get a divorce and move on with their lives, believe me, I asked myself that question all the time. The truth is, I think they both avoided divorce because it was easier to stay in this detached, dysfunctional arrangement than to go through the financial and legal mess of separation. Divorces can cost a fortune, especially when it comes to alimony, legal fees, and fighting over child custody, which neither of them seemed to want to deal with. Both of my parents were earning well, but the only major expense they really shared was my education. Aside from that, they barely spent anything on me. My dad owned the house, so there wasn't much they had to split financially other than the household bills. They didn't need to argue over material things, each had their own car, and their own groceries, and lived mostly separate lives under the same roof. As for me, my dad would give me money every week, enough to cover my school lunches and groceries for myself. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough for me to manage, and I didn't really expect much more. They were wrapped up in their own lives, and their own resentments, and I had adapted to living in the background. When I was about to turn 17, I decided I wanted to have a birthday celebration for myself, something real for a change. Up until then, my birthdays had always been a bit of a non-event. My dad, bless him, had a habit of forgetting my birthday unless I reminded him. Once I did, he'd make an effort, usually getting me a cake, and we'd either celebrate quietly at home or go out for a simple dinner. But it was always just the two of us, never anything more. This time, I wanted something bigger. I wanted to invite my friends over and have a real party. Surprisingly, my dad agreed. He said it was a great idea and helped me plan it. My mom, of course, refused to attend. She didn't even bother with an excuse, she just made it clear she didn't want to be involved. Honestly, I didn't care at that point. I had gotten used to her absence, both physically and emotionally, so the fact that she wouldn't be there didn't faze me. For the first time in my life, I got what I had wished for, a birthday party with friends, laughter, and joy. It wasn't extravagant, but it was perfect for me. For a brief moment, I was genuinely happy. I had finally learned to accept my life for what it was, with all its imperfections. But, as if the universe couldn't stand to see me happy, that brief moment of joy was soon overshadowed by tragedy when my dad passed away. It felt surreal. Here I was, just 17, inheriting the house we lived in, while my mom continued to hate me. She couldn't stand the fact that my dad had given me the house, and made her disdain towards me very clear. She shouted at me for hours after the will reading was done about how I must have manipulated my dad over the years and how she was the rightful owner. Then, her tactics changed. She started to convince me to change the deed of the house to her name. Thankfully, my grandparents, my dad's parents, stood up for me. They made sure that my mother could not manipulate me. They made it clear to her that she was never a good wife to my dad while he was alive, hence she did not deserve to get his house just because he had now passed away. They threatened to take her to court if she tried to force me to change the deed. In a fit of anger, my mom threatened to abandon me. She said that since I was selfish enough to not give her the house, she wanted to teach me a lesson to show me that I couldn't survive without her. It was almost as though she wanted me to believe that I was incapable of living on my own, as if losing her, too, would make me realize how much I needed her in my life. My paternal grandparents didn't back down. They told my mom that if she left, they would step in and take care of me. They told her that unlike her, they would be there for me, not just until I turned 18, but for the rest of my life, no matter what. Just 2 or 3 weeks after my dad passed away, my mom made good on her threat and actually left. Before she left the house, my mom threw out my dad's entire comic book collection, something he had cherished and collected for years, as her one final act of revenge. She clearly did it out of spite, in some way to hurt me, to erase him, to make me pay for whatever anger she harbored inside. She told me how I would come crawling back to her in a few years when I had amounted to nothing. Her words were venomous, designed to break me down even more at a time when I was already feeling completely lost. She abandoned me as if I meant nothing to her. The fact that she could walk away so easily, so soon after my dad's death, was something I couldn't wrap my head around. It was like I had lost both parents within the span of weeks, and the weight of it was crushing. My paternal grandparents, true to their word, moved in with me. They did everything they could to provide me with stability and care during this time. My grandpa and grandma were kind, gentle souls, and they knew how deeply I was hurting. Even though they were grieving, too, they put their own pain aside to be there for me. Meanwhile, I was just trying to survive day by day. My heart was heavy with the loss of my dad, and the abandonment by my mom left me feeling even more isolated. It was like I was living in a fog, unable to fully understand what was happening around me. Each day, I forced myself to get up, get dressed, and go to school. I was still in high school, and as much as I wanted to shut down completely, I knew I had to finish my education so I could be someone in my life. My mother's words kept ringing in my head about how I would be nothing without her. I made a promise to myself that I would work hard for the rest of my life and make sure that I was successful. During this incredibly difficult time in my life, my maternal grandparents also made a point to check in on me frequently. They were as shocked and upset as I was by my mom's actions and were furious that their daughter had abandoned me after my dad's death. In fact, they carried a lot of guilt for it. For the past 5 years, I've worked hard to build a life for myself. Despite everything, I managed to push through, graduated from college last year with honors, cum laude, and landed a great job in IT. The job has been an amazing opportunity, especially since it allows me to work remotely. This flexibility has given me the chance to travel the world while still working, something that feels like a dream considering everything I've been through. I never thought I'd be in this place, living a life that feels full of possibility, but somehow, I made it through those dark days. I still live in the house that my dad left me, and it has been a blessing in more ways than I can count. Not only did it provide me with stability during college, but it also allowed me to save a significant amount of money that I would have otherwise spent on rent. The money my dad had left for me and some more financial help from my paternal grandparents helped me get through college without any student loans. After getting my job, I've been slowly renovating the house, room by room, to make it more of my own. Each update in the house feels like I'm reclaiming and putting my own stamp on the place that holds so many memories, both good and bad. My paternal grandparents, though they've moved back to their own home now, continue to check in on me regularly. I visit them as often as I can, and our bond remains strong. I'll always be grateful to them for stepping in when I needed them the most. As for my mom, she had never contacted me once in all these years. I did hear bits and pieces from cousins on her side of the family, and from what I've gathered, she has never regretted her decision to walk away from me. I also heard through the grapevine that she got remarried and is now living a very extravagant life with her new husband. I suppose in the end, she got everything she ever wanted, a life free from responsibility, living on her own terms. Last week, out of nowhere, my mom reached out to me for the first time in 5 years. She started with an email. She probably got my email address from my LinkedIn or maybe through someone. In the email, she wrote about how she wanted to talk, saying she had missed bonding with me all these years. When I saw her name in my inbox, I didn't feel anything, no anger, no sadness, no longing. If this had happened 5 years ago, I probably would have been desperate for her attention, craving her approval, and jumping at the chance to reconnect. Back then, I would have done anything to get her love. But now, it was like reading an email from a stranger. Her words didn't stir any emotions in me. If anything, I felt irritated just seeing her message. So I made the choice not to reply. After that, she began calling me incessantly. I have no idea how she got my number, maybe one of my cousins gave it to her, but she left me several voicemails. In each one, she talked about how much she would love to meet and reconnect. I ignored every single one. I had spent years moving on, healing in my own way, and I didn't need her dragging me back to that dark place. Then, last week, she sent me a long text message. This one was different. She said that she truly regretted everything she had done and that she wanted to just meet up and apologize. She claimed she had done some serious thinking over the past few years and now wanted to make things right with me. I would be lying if I said I wasn't a bit curious after reading that message. For the first time, she seemed to be taking accountability for her actions, something she had never done before. I wasn't ready to forgive her, but I did wonder what had caused this sudden change of heart. Was she really sorry? Could she actually mean it? Or was this just another selfish ploy to ease her own guilt? The next time she called, I picked up. Her persistence was starting to get under my skin, and I wanted to know what she really wanted. So, when I answered, I bluntly asked her what it was that she wanted from me. I told my mom to speak quickly and made it clear that if she didn't have something worthwhile to say, I'd block her and be done with it all in the next 5 minutes. She immediately panicked, begging me not to cut her off. Her voice cracked as she said she missed me, and now that she was older, she hated herself for everything she had done. I could hear the desperation in her voice as she apologized over and over, telling me she had finally realized the gravity of her actions. She went on to say that she understood if I didn't want to have a relationship with her, that much was obvious. But what she really wanted, she claimed, was just to meet with me. She said she wanted to explain why she had done what she did all those years ago, as if there could possibly be any explanation that would justify abandoning me. I couldn't help but scoff. I had heard enough excuses from her to last a lifetime. I told her I had already made peace with the way things were, and that I had accepted everything without needing any closure from her. I didn't need to know her reasons, I didn't care, but she kept pushing me to at least have dinner with her. She promised that if I didn't like what she had to say, I could walk away and block her, and she would never bother me again. Her desperation was almost unsettling. It didn't sit right with me, something felt off. Why now? Why, after 5 years of silence, was she suddenly so eager to make amends? The same woman who cursed me and told me I would amount to nothing had now resurfaced, begging for one chance to explain herself. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this sudden change of heart. It all seemed too calculated, too sudden, as if she had some ulterior motive. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I smelled something fishy. Despite my better judgment, I decided to play along. I just wanted to see what this was really about. So, begrudgingly, I agreed to have dinner with her and her new husband. The dinner was at my mom's new place, and it was clear from the moment I stepped inside that she was living a completely different life. The house was incredibly posh, decorated with lavish furniture, expensive art, and elegant touches everywhere. Her new husband, Bill, seemed warm and friendly enough. He introduced himself politely, and we made small talk, but the whole atmosphere felt awkward, like there was this giant unspoken tension between us. During dinner, when I excused myself to go to the washroom, I couldn't help but notice the bedrooms as I passed by. They were beautifully decorated, almost as if they were from a high-end catalog. What caught my attention even more were the photos lining the walls, pictures of my mom and Bill smiling together, traveling to exotic locations around the world. They seemed happy and carefree. Seeing that made me sad. She was never like that with me and my dad. I had never seen her smile like that with us. The contrast hit me harder than I expected, and it stirred up feelings I thought I had buried. As I was walking back from the washroom, I heard my mom and Bill talking in low voices. They hadn't noticed I was coming, so I paused, curious, trying to listen to what they were talking about. This is when I heard my mom telling Bill how much she hated seeing me and how much I reminded her so much of Dad. My stomach dropped. Bill was trying to console her, but she just kept going, complaining that she wished she didn't have to go through with this whole dinner. Impulsively, I pulled out my phone and started recording. I don't even know why. Maybe it was just a reflex, like part of me wanted proof of how vile she really was. Maybe I thought I'd watch it later to fully process what was happening. Either way, I hit record. That's when I heard my mom tell Bill that if it weren't for her parents insisting that she reconnect with me, she never would have reached out. She went on to say that she hated her parents for pushing her to do this and that she was only going through the motions to secure her inheritance from them because of their conditions. Hearing her say those words, hearing that this dinner, this whole charade, was just a means to an end for her, made everything click. It all made sense now. My mom hadn't suddenly developed a conscience, she hadn't done any deep reflection, and she certainly didn't regret abandoning me. My instincts had been right all along. I stood there for a moment, frozen, my heart racing. I had suspected something was off, but hearing her say she hated being around me, that she didn't want to be doing this, cut deeper than I thought it would. After all these years, after everything, she was still the same selfish person who only cared about herself. I turned off the recording and walked out. The moment she saw me, she fell silent. Without saying a word, I thanked Bill for dinner and headed for the door, ignoring my mother as she kept calling after me, asking why I was leaving so abruptly. Later, she messaged me, accusing me of embarrassing her in front of her husband and wishing I could just be more open with her, because, after all, she's my mother. I'm absolutely furious with her and haven't texted her back. Am I the a-hole for walking off in the middle of dinner after what I heard my mother talk about? Update 1. I want to clarify that the reason I didn't confront my mother right then and there in her house after what I heard is that I've always accepted her for who she is. It didn't really surprise me, to be honest. I knew she had an ulterior motive all along, and I was right. I'm actually glad I met with her and got that recording. I plan to confront my maternal grandparents with it tomorrow and get to the bottom of things. Update 2. So, I met with my maternal grandparents and shared everything with them. At first, they were pleasantly surprised that my mother wanted to reconnect with me. But once I played the recording of her telling Bill that her only motive was the inheritance, their expressions quickly changed. My grandfather looked furious, while my grandmother apologized to me. She confessed that they had been discussing their will recently and had made it clear to my mother, 2 months ago, that they didn't want to leave anything to her because they were too disappointed in her after she had abandoned me. Instead, the inheritance would go to their older children. My mother had begged them to reconsider, and that's when my grandfather told her that if she reconnected with me, she could be included in the will. In her desperation, she had decided to reach out to me. I shook my head as my grandfather awkwardly apologized and said he thought it was a good idea at the time. He told me he believed my mother had finally matured after all these years, but clearly, he was mistaken. I told him not to blame himself and that he and my grandmother should have known better. My mother is just self-centered. Thankfully, I wasn't fooled and caught her right at the start. My grandfather promised me that instead of giving my mother her share of the inheritance, he was going to give it to me instead. Update 3. After my talk with my maternal grandparents, it wasn't even a day before my mother called, screaming at me. I hadn't blocked her on purpose. I knew this was my chance to get my revenge on her and unload everything. She yelled at me for exposing her to her parents and claimed I should have talked to her first. She said I had no right to confront Grandpa and threatened to ruin my life. I couldn't help but laugh at her words and reminded her firmly that I was no longer the child she had abused and abandoned all those years ago. I asked if her husband knew exactly what kind of woman she was or if I should send him an email detailing everything she had done to me over the years. She fell silent at that. I told her I still had the recording from dinner, where she confessed her true motive, and that I wouldn't hesitate to expose her publicly to all our relatives and cousins if necessary. She backtracked, insisting that I should have at least some respect for her as a parent and not threaten her since she was the one who gave birth to me after months of suffering. I scoffed and reminded her that it was her choice to go through that, and she couldn't keep holding me responsible for it after all these years. I declared that I was done with her manipulations and that she needed to stay as far away from my life as possible. Otherwise, I wouldn't hesitate to ruin her life by exposing her truth to everyone. I've since blocked her, and I don't think she'll ever dare to contact me again.